Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammad Tabakuli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to the Institute of Iranian Studies book launch featuring Dr. Hamid Rezaei Yazdi's brilliant translation of Ahmad Kasravi's Ayin as Ethos, a critique of Eurocentric modernity. We are grateful to Dr. Yazdi for accepting our invitation and joining us here on campus today. I'm also grateful to the Roshan Cultural Heritage Foundation and Dr. Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali for their exemplary support of the Institute. At the outset, and before introducing our speaker, I would like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. My colleague, Shabnam Brahimi-Gulkhandan, the exemplary managing editor of Cinema and Women Poets Compendia, will introduce Dr. Yazdi and will moderate today's session. Shabnam.
Thank you, Ostad. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce my good friend and our esteemed colleague, Dr. Rezaei Yazdi. Dr. Yazdi has received his PhD from the Department of Near Middle Eastern Studies, where we're sitting right now, at the University of Toronto. Informed by post-colonial thought, his research challenges the binaristic paradigms that view non-Western modernity as the account of a tension-filled, failure-bound opposition between the synchronic categories of modern and traditional. Dr. Yazdi offers an alternative paradigm rooted in the historicity of such terms by positing that Iranian modernities involved a dialogical synthesis of the novel and the traditional. Analyzing the re-employment of the classical genre of the munazara in the 19th and 20th centuries, Yazdi argues that an important and enduring feature of Iranian modernity involves the rivalry, overlap, appropriation, and refashioning of a polyphonic array of local, regional, and transnational ideas and practices. His research and publications are attempts at highlighting this alternative history. These include an article titled The Dialogical Tradition of Iranian Modernity, Munazara, Simultaneity, and the Making of Modern Iran, and published in an edited volume titled Persian Literature and Modernity, Production and Reception. A monograph brilliantly edited and translated into Persian by Dr. Yasser Farashahi-Nejad titled مدرنیته گفتگویی جمالزاده و افسانه پدری داستان نویسی طرح نو, and a translation of Ahmad Kasravi's Ayin from Persian into English titled Ethos, a critique of Eurocentric modernity. It's published in 2023 by Ethos. He teaches at the Department of Liberal Studies at Humber College and at the University of Guelph Humber. And because we don't have the book on the presentation, I'm just showing you the cover right here because I'm very fond of the cover itself. Dr. Yazdi, please, I'll share the PowerPoint presentation in a minute.
Thank you, Professor Tabakuli and Shabnam, for a very generous introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being here, whether you're in the room or online, for this book launch session. Before we begin, I'd like to make some brief acknowledgements. The idea of this book, this project, came from none other than the amazing Professor Tabakuli, whose brilliant introduction now graces this book. And although I also benefited from his creativity in translating the title of the book and also the fantastic cover image. So thank you, Professor. Professor Ali Mir-Sepasi of NYU also provided valuable feedback when the book was first pitched to Cambridge University Press. So thank you, Professor Mir-Sepasi as well. Dr. Stanislaw Jaskowski kindly agreed to contribute to this book, and his excellent critical essay now appears in the afterword. Thank you as well. Evan Siegel, the translator of Kasravi's History of the Constitutional Revolution, read my translation and provided invaluable feedback along the way. I've thanked all these individuals and others in the acknowledgement section of the book. Here's the plan for today's talk. I'd like to start with an agenda for the sake of clarity and organization. In the first part of the talk, I'll briefly go over the larger context that prompted this project in the first place. In a few minutes, you'll hopefully see why this section is titled Binarism. I will then spend a few minutes explaining why this particular work, Ayn, was selected for translation as opposed to Kasravi's more controversial or perhaps more widely known books, such as Shia-Gari, which of course has been translated, Sufi-Gari or Baha'i-Gari. And what exactly is the status of Ayn in Kasravi's book? The last part of today's presentation will delve into the key arguments of the Ayn itself. Next slide, please. Okay, so I thought we would, perfect. I'd like to start the presentation today with a reflection activity, hopefully, in order to be able to engage the audience a little bit as well. So I'm not the only one here carrying the monologue. Please feel free to share your responses verbally or in the chat room, or you can simply reflect on it quietly if you so choose. And here's the reflection question. If you had to pick a label for these two gentlemen, these two modern Iranian thinkers, who would you pick as a secular nationalist intellectual, and which one would you pick as a religious Islamist intellectual?
Kasravi, secular nationalist.
Kasravi would be typically would be the secular nationalist, and Shariati would be the Islamist. And I'm sure, as Abu has said, by now you've figured out the point I'm trying to get at with this. We've all been taught to duly name Ali Shariati as the Islamist thinker and Kasravi as a secular nationalist. This dualism, this binaristic view has dominated accounts of the history of modern Iran for too long. Next slide, please. And it has even found its way into foreign press, trying to make sense of recent events in contemporary Iran. As you can see here, even in the 21st century, it's a piece from The Guardian, modern Iranian history is read as an account of a conflict between those binaries, and a tragic one at that. The archives, however, and history itself tell a much more nuanced story that defies this type of clear-cut binarism. Next slide, please. Like many other figures in the intellectual history of modern Iran, Kasravi was a product of two worlds, occupying a liminal space where the traditional and the modern synthesized. As a young man, he started off in seminary school, as you can see here, but later abandoned turban and clerical robe for suits and ties. This intellectual liminality disrupts the type of easy or clear-cut binaries that we've been looking at. As Dr. Jaskowski argues in the afterword in the book, quote, the image of Kasravi, which seems to have dominated public imagination, that of a secular intellectual, is not only incorrect, it is in complete contrast to Kasravi's ideas broadly considered, end quote. I would add to this apt observation what I have already mentioned in the notes on the translation section in the book, that the works of Kasravi, which have so far been translated into English, they've almost become a genre in their own right. And they tend to precisely paint Kasravi to the English reader as a bow tie wearing, clean-shaved crusader against tradition and religion. That is far from the truth, however. while being critical of aspects of, and we'll get into that later, aspects of tradition and religion, which he found problematic, Kasravi also wrote numerous works critiquing Eurocentrism and a Eurocentric adoption of modernity. Ain is arguably Kasravi's pioneering work on this topic. And as you'll later see, many of Kasravi's later works can in many ways be seen as extensions of his main arguments in Ain. And so the overarching goal of this translation project from the outset was to disrupt, at least for the English reader, precisely this binaristic way of looking at the history of modern Iran as the account of a clash, an opposition between the supposed and exclusive forces of tradition and modernity. I think and hope that the present book falls within the purview of a relatively recent and exciting trend in scholarship on modern Iran that is working to problematize this either-or account of modern Iranian history. Okay, let's move on to our second point, not the, on the agenda, and that's the question of all of Kasravi's works, why translate Ain? Surely some of Kasravi's other works, particularly the big three, written in the final decade of his life, Shi'agari, Sufigari, and Bahaigari, which he kind of saw as the extension of Shi'agari. Surely these books have could have been better candidates for this translation project. Why Ain? People don't seem to know a lot about it anyway, but people, seem to know a lot about those three. These books caused, as you know, no shortage of controversy and scandal, from street fights to protests to calls to declare Kasravi an apostate and for his execution. And the splash that these three books made was not limited to his lifetime. Next slide, please. Numerous responses were written in reaction to these books, not only during his lifetime. We might think of, Al Ahmad's Dar Khidmat Khiyanat Roshanfikran, but well into the late 20th and early 21st century, as you can see from these examples. Most of these reactions rejected Kasravi, but next slide, please. Some also weaponized his ideas for various ideological causes. Here's an interesting example on a portal of Iranian Sunnis, kind of appropriating Kasravi to further the Sunni cause. So again, those three books have been co-opted in so many different ways and created such a big splash. Why translate Ain? As mentioned above in our discussion of binarism, one of the reasons that Kasravi has been imagined as solely a secular nationalist is, as Dr. Jaskowski ably articulates in the afterword, is that the works Kasravi penned toward the end of his life, and that includes the big three, are seen as the representatives of his entire career. Next slide. In other words, Shi'agari, Sufigari, Bahaigari, and similar works such as Hafiz Che Miguyad and Dar Piramune Adabiyat, partly due to the widespread controversy they caused, have often been cited as proof of Kasravi's anti-religious, secularist, and nationalist stance. These late works, however, and here's an interesting point, happen to be among Kasravi's least critical and least academically rigorous works. Next slide. There is almost no trace of the formidable scholar one sees in his earlier works, such as Azeri ya Zabane Bastan Azerbaijan, which first made his name as a scientific linguist on an international level, or his monumental Tarikh Mashrute, which established him as a robust analytical historian. Unlike these early works, Shi'agari, Sufigari, Bahaigari, Hafiz Che Miguyad, and Dar Piramune Adabiyat are actually populist in style, very sensationalist in tone and filled with gross overgeneralizations and historical inaccuracies, and even personal attacks, such as when in Shiagari, for instance, Kasravi refers to Haja Nasiruddin Tusi as, quote, that irreligious, gluttonous man, on Marde Bidin Shekam Parast. These works were also not entirely based on research, it seems, but seemingly driven by Kasravi's personal opinion about the topic. When questioned about his knowledge of Maulana Rumi, for example, this came up when somebody was questioning him about the book Sufigari, and somebody asked him, so what do you know about Rumi? Kasravi responded that he had read, quote, bits and pieces here and there, inja o anja khande. Other scholars confirm this as well. Renowned Kasravi specialist Muhammad Amini, for instance, considers Sufigari and Baha'i as some of the least historically and analytically rigorous works of Kasravi, which were written in a populist fashion and were an attempt on the part of Kasravi to prove that he was not attacking Shiism alone. It could also be partly because by dismissing Shiism, Sufism, and Baha'ism as falsehoods, Kasravi was trying to clear the path, as it were, to make room for his own Barjab and Bunyad, published 1943, which would serve as a quasi-scripture for his new religion, Pak Dini, as Kasravi felt this prophetic mission in the final decade of his life. This brings us to Ain. Next slide, please. Similar to Azari ya Zaban Bastan Azerbaijan, which established Kasravi as a scholar of linguistics, or Tarikh Mashrute, among other works that exhibited his scholarly prowess as an historian, Ain displayed his critical vision as a social reformer, and thus can be seen as a foundational text in Kasravi's social and religious works. Much of Kasravi's later works read actually as extensions of the key arguments in Ain, as is explained in the afterword to the volume by Dr. Jaskowski. Quote, this is particularly evident in the early issues of the journal Peyman, where copious reference to and quotations from Ain resemble referencing a revered manifesto, end quote. Although it has largely been overlooked, Ain is among his most influential and consequential works. And I'm going to enumerate 4 reasons to substantiate this claim. First, Ain is a revolutionary text. Next slide, please. I'd like to draw your attention to take a look at this very famous magazine spread from Judge Magazine, 1899. You see Uncle Sam and John Bull carrying the rest of us to civilization. It is on top there. And on the way, they have to overcome our vices and ignorance and so on. And this painting was done on the basis of British poet Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden. So similar to, sorry, my apologies. At a time when colonial dominance was seen as a fact of nature, attesting to the racial and intellectual superiority of Europe, at a time when colonial exploitation was put forth as the white man's burden to civilize the rest of the world, at a time when imperialist expansion was justified as the white man's civilizing mission, at a time when such racist ideas and imperialist ideas were not only accepted but celebrated by the advocates of Europe in Iran and elsewhere, these days still are, Kasravi's Ain made a radical and subversive intervention. The contemporary West was actually the epitome of barbarism and uncivility. If civilization meant the peaceful coexistence of humans, then the collective West had utterly failed at attaining civilization. a task that Kasravi argued had been successfully achieved by Eastern prophets and religions, particularly Islam. A second reason is that much of Kasravi's line of thought in Ayn is an extension of his censure of Orientalism. Even some of what is often perceived as a Kasravi's attack on Iranian tradition can be read in the context of his larger project of critiquing Orientalism. For much of what Kasravi criticizes in the Perso-Islamic tradition, he considers as a fabrication resulting from Orientalism, such as the promotion of Sufism, for instance, or the creation of the Persian literary canon. He saw this as a European ploy to promote superstition, indolence, moral degeneration, fatalism, and lack of activism among the Iranian populace. Interestingly, he extended his critique of Sufism to European sciences, seeing them as the two sides of the same coin, the flip sides of the same coin. Next slide, please. So here's a quote, for example, from Sufi Getty. I'll give you a moment to look at it, where he is basically equating Sufism and modern European sciences. One leads to indolence, the other leads to materialism, and they're the same. And he says, well, actually, materialism is worse. He goes on to say that Sufism drives people to indolence and inactivity, while materialism drives them to greed, deception, and destructive wars. The third reason involves the extent to which, as a foundational text, Ayn informed Kasravi's other works. Again, Dr. Jaskowski has done the hard work on this in the afterwards, so I'll be liberally referring to his excellent piece here. Kasravi himself considered Ayn to be the forerunner of Peyman, Pishroe Peyman, his journal. Although Kasravi himself designated Barjav and Bunyad, his book in 1943, as his defining work and the culmination of his career, the readership begged to differ. This, as Dr. Jaskowski explains, is partly due to the cryptic language employed in Barjav and Bunyad, which was not that accessible to the public and ended up alienating many readers and followers of Kasravi. Importantly, this is partly why Kasravi considered it necessary to explain to his readers why he hadn't reprinted Ayn in a piece titled, well, چرا آیین را چاپ نمی‌کنیم دوباره چاپ نمی‌کنیم, why aren't we printing Ayn again? He saw it necessary to actually write a piece on it and publish it in Peyman in May 1943. This speaks to the widespread popularity of Ayn at a time of its publication, a fact that's also attested to by its publication in several editions after it first appeared. Especially as World War II was raging at this time, we're talking 1943, many saw Ayn and not Barjav and Bunyad as the prophetic text that had predicted the occurrence of World War II. And that's true. When you go through the book, you see, he'll say there will soon be another one. He will talk about the Great War, and then he'll say there will soon be a second, and also had foreseen other developments. Thus, roughly the first 4 years of Kasravi's popular journal, Peyman, can be seen as an extended footnote to Ayn. The journal would gradually shift its focus to the censure of Perso-Islamic tradition and Shiism and to the attendant promotion of Kasravi's Pak Dini, but that is precisely what, according to Dr. Jaskowski, led to most of the previous readers abandoning Peyman around its 4th year of publication, end quote. Thus, much as Kasravi tried to promote Barjav and Bunyad as his defining and groundbreaking book, the sheer popularity and influence of Ayn seemed to supersede this authorial intent. The fourth and final reason for the significance of Ayn is its immense influence and on contemporary and future generations, as well as its relevance today, its long shelf life, if you will. And here I'm going to reference Professor Tabakkoli liberally. So the concept that when we talk about the influence that Ayn actually exerted on future generations of intellectuals, the concept of qardzadegi, as we all know, or Westoxication, is usually associated with Jalal al-Ahmad, and before him, perhaps Ahmad Fardid. However, as Professor Tabakkoli points out in his brilliant introduction to the book, both Fardid and Ahmad drew on Kasravi's work. Kasravi's critique of Europeism informed the works of not just these two gentlemen, but many others: Rahimzadeh Safavi, Rezazadeh Shafaq, Fakhruddin Shadman, Ali Shariati. His theorization of rationalist Islam, which, as we shall see, is a key argument in Ayn, was picked up by the Islamist strategists like Ghulam Reza Saedi, Ja'far Shahidi, Muhammad Nakhshab, Muhammad Taghi Shariati, and Islamist journals like Parcham Islam, Dunyay Islam, and Maktab Islam. And finally, his critique of Orientalism was co-opted by the likes of Dariush Ashuri, Ehsan Naraghi, and Hamid Enayat, among others. Another feature of Ayn is its sophistication and depth of argument. Unlike much of the nativist works, not just in Iran, but also elsewhere in the global South, which sought the solution to colonialism and Eurocentrism in a total disassociation from the collective West, Kasravi's analysis is actually rooted in a conscious awareness of discursive constructs, East and West. Interesting, Said is going to talk about that, 4 decades later. Next slide, please, or 5 decades later. So as you can see in this quote, he's exhibiting a very conscious awareness that is kind of avoiding, again, the pitfall of that kind of binarism we've been talking about. So for Kasravi, the path to liberation from Eurocentric notions of progress and the final solution to the problem was, you guessed it, religion. However, and that goes against the image of Kasravi as a secular nationalist intellectual. However, as Professor Tabakkoli has noted in the introduction, quote, Kasravi's definition of religion resembled the use of ideology in his contemporary Europe, end quote. Kasravi's notion of religion involved an ethical and rationalist program rooted in Islamic beliefs, but still very much future-oriented and attentive to adoption of useful Western technology, a combination that would emancipate humanity from cutthroat competitive capitalism and the attendant destructions and wars, while leading humanity towards communal well-being. In other words, Kasravi's use of the term religion should not be, quote, understood as a system of dogmas and rituals, but as an ethos of coexistence, hence the title of the book, focused on helping humankind live in peace and prosperity. In short, to live like human beings should, not like wild predatory animals, end quote. In many ways then, and as we'll further see, Ayn was a forerunner of post-colonial criticism, and I don't think I write enough paragraphs to really emphasize this. Decades before prominent figures in post-colonial literature, such as Frantz Fanon, Walter Rodney, Aimé Césaire, one of the creators of the concept of negritude, Edward Said, Rashid Khaledi, Samir Amin, who, by the way, coined the term Eurocentrism, and others, Kasravi's critique of Eurocentrism, which he called Europeism or Urupai-Garai, contained the seeds of what would later be fashionably termed post-colonialism in the lecture halls of Western universities. And with this translation, I hope Ayn can find its due place in the cadre of books from the global South, which we would posthumously and fashionably call post-colonial. For this same reason, among all other works by Kasravi, Ayn is still arguably the most relevant to our own time. I, for one, when I was translating the book, found myself on numerous occasions astonished at how accurately Kasravi's insights from the 1930s, almost 100 years ago, can be applied to the state of the world today, as you will hopefully see later as we get into the book itself. I think the question of relevance is a good point to transition to the final part of today's presentation, and that's on the question, what is Ayin about? Before we begin, please note that in Ayin, Kasravi uses the designation Europe to refer to the collective West. He even makes that clear on the very first page. In a footnote, he says, wherever I say Europe, I mean Europe and America, whatever is West, the collective West. So please keep that in mind as we discuss his notion of Europism or Urufagaroi. The scathing censure of Europism, what Kasravi terms, Eurocentrism, what Kasravi terms Europism or Urufagaroi, is the bedrock upon which the various arguments in Ayin are built. Kasravi considers Europism a plague infecting Eastern societies, and he sees it as his mission to dispel the myth of European superiority. Except for a few useful innovations in the medical field, for instance, Kasravi deems the rest of European inventions as little more than, quote, tool-making, machine sazi, whose only result has been increasing hardships in human life, conflict, and wars. He blames Europe for the malady of godlessness, alienation, and angst in Western societies. To him, modern European philosophy is an extension of Darwinism, which has reduced human life to the level of animals and brutes due to its overemphasis on competition and survival. Even so, Kasravi believes that we should still learn about and adopt Europe's useful industry and tool making, but at the same time, we should absolutely avoid all of Europe's other teachings and ways of life. He rejects Europe's boasts about being pioneers of modern civilization and argues that etymologically, the word civilization, civility, which in Persian shahrigari, which is his coinage, and in Arabic tamaddun, again Medina, both of them all refer, and even the word civilization, shahrigari, tamaddun, all refer to the city, civility, a condition that the West has long abandoned, according to Kasravi, and has, or basically living together peacefully in a city or in a community. Civilization, tamaddun, shahrigari. These are conditions that Kasravi tells us the West has abandoned and has instead been pursuing a life befitting animals and predators. He'll give us lots of examples, don't worry. Europism, or the mimetic project, as Professor Tavakoli beautifully puts it, the mimetic project of following in the path of the West leads to nothing other than a malicious destiny, all-gabatishun. Dismissing claims to Europe's superiority by the collective West and its advocates, Kasravi proceeds to examine the social, political, economic, and cultural conditions of contemporary West in the rest of the book. His goal is to warn Iranians of the perils of following in the West's injurious path and proposes a program of vernacular modernity based on a return to the ancient wisdom of the East, a rationalist and future-oriented Islam, and a selective adoption of Europe's technological know-how. He begins by examining the definition of progress, about which Europe boasts so much. The universal meaning of progress is a better life for all humanity, Kasravi tells us, right? Since time immemorial, humans have had two major battles in life. One is to overcome nature, the hardships of nature. Second, to compete and battle against other human beings for survival and security and so on. True progress would alleviate both of these struggles for humanity. However, the West's inventions have only helped humanity overcome nature to some extent through telephones, trains, airplanes. But these inventions have intensified the other challenge, which is the struggle among humans tenfold, he says. How can the West boast of progress while it has increased rather than decreased conflict and destructive wars among humans? Keep in mind that in 1932, when this was published, World War I would have been in very recent history or memory of people. What is the use of organizations like the League of Nations and numerous international conventions then if they couldn't stop the Great War? Kasravi asks. Next slide, please. So here Kasravi gives us a kind of one of the examples of where he's saying, yeah, sure, true. They've made some stuff, railroads and trains and airplanes, but hey, have they really improved our lives? So I'll give you a moment to go over that. Here, Kasravi invokes these examples to drive home the point that much of the West's scientific and technological advancement, at best, does not exceed the level of tool making, abzar sazi. They may be tools that provide convenience in some areas of life, yes, but they obviously lack the wisdom to alleviate human suffering or to improve the human condition in general. Worse yet, in the previous centuries, humans fought their battles using swords and lances, but today, no thanks to European discoveries in the sciences of mechanics and chemistry, for example, and other technologies, humans can kill each other in the thousands with the use of lethal weapons. Is this progress? Kasravi asks. Quote, if we look at it from the perspective of the benefit or harm to the world, the claim to progress is the most nonsensical of claims. End quote. Next. And here is another quote where he's talking about machinery of homicide, how Europe's technology has really mostly meant we can just kill more people more easily, more effectively, if that's the right term. Along the same lines, Kasravi makes a specific reference to the Western military industrial complex, whose chief goal is profit, which is sustainable only when there are wars, and blames it, the military industrial complex, for inciting wars and for building machinery of homicide and promoting bloodshed and murder at the market value. بازار خونریزی و جانستان. This is where Kasravi proposes that the only solution to this problem, a solution that has been working for centuries, is, you guessed it, religion, defined as Professor Talakli said earlier, as an ethical ethos of coexistence and not as a series of dogmas and rituals. The East is the cradle of religions, and Europe has many lessons to learn from the East in this regard. But today, as a result of Europeism, irreligiosity has replaced religion the world over. The result has been the disappearance of piety, charity, modesty, selflessness, righteousness, and the emergence in its place of tokens of Europeism. Irreligiosity, impiety, egotism, pleasure-seeking, greed, duplicity, falsehood, short-sightedness, and merciless competition. This is more evident in large, he says, in large or capital cities like Tehran in the East, where Europeism has been more rampant. We see more of this impiety and egotism and duplicity and so on. And then he goes on to say that about in smaller towns, people are still very nice because they're still following the wisdom of Eastern tradition. Kasravi rejects the argument, this is very important, rejects the argument made by some that law can and has replaced religion. So what's the problem? He makes the case that humans will by nature try to evade man-made laws. This creates an endless loop in modern legal system whereby inspectors must be appointed to oversee implementation of the law. But since the inspectors are also prone to evading the law and corruption, more inspectors need to be appointed to oversee the previous inspectors, and so on and so forth in an endless loop. To provide an example of this, Kasravi makes reference, alludes, as he usually does, to the Prohibition era in American history, and citing a speech, again, alluding to a speech by then President Roosevelt, points out how all the strict laws failed at stopping the gangsters from paying out the police and carrying out their usual activities. The solution? Religion. For it is only religion that can instill virtues in humans that would incite them to voluntarily shun wrongdoing. Kasravi then launches into a critique of intensified social inequalities and increased mechanization, as a result of which millions of workers have become homeless and unemployed in America, England, Germany, Poland, and the rest of Europe. Admonishing capitalism, and this is really important, as an irrational economic system, Kasravi unleashes an attack on the West's obsession with profit, rampant consumerism, and excessive production. Quote, Europe has made commerce the center and life the periphery. More clearly, Europe demands people's livelihoods to bolster trade, creating a situation in which people must purchase whatever goods it produces in its factories, whether they have a need for it or not. Next slide, please. In a fascinating passage, this one, Kasravi even alludes to perhaps one of the earliest observations about the perversity of the concept of planned obsolescence. You know, how the manufacturers will make something that will expire, and we're not talking about grocery, electronics, cars, in 5 years. And this was a proposal, actually, that was put forth by an American businessman in the 1930s as a solution to recover American economy from the woes of the Great Depression. And he notes their obsession with this. They've even come up with this perverse idea of planned obsolescence. Kasravi then argues that ideas such as progress, civilization, and advancement, which have been used for so long to belittle and pacify any objection to Europe's superiority, are a ploy to promote Western imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism. The main agents of this strategy have been Iranian Europeists. Their role is to utilize ridicule, rishkhand, sarkuf, to induce the people of the East to abandon or reject their own ancient and modest mode of life in order to prepare them psychologically, Kasravi says, to submit to European domination of their societies, cultures, markets, and resources. European industries needed ever more markets to feed their factories and fatten their pockets, as well as the justification to subjugate or occupy Eastern lands and to plunder their wealth, Eastern wealth. This task was delegated to the Eastern Euro enthusiasts, who spread lies about how Europe is heaven on earth and that Iran must become fully Europeanized, all the while masking the reality of Europe's miserable post-war conditions: unemployment, homelessness, hunger, the Great Depression, and a looming Second Great War, which he refers to several times in the book. And of course, and this is why later people say, look, he even predicted the occurrence of the Second World War. Admonishing these Europeists, Kasravi describes them as, quote, the wretched who have rendered their hearts to Europe, del dadegan furumaye Urupa, and who are either, quote, mercenaries of European companies or hate their own land and home. Otherwise, the notion of European superiority and distinctiveness is the cheapest babble, end quote. The way to counter this ploy, Kasravi believed, was for Eastern people to embrace their own ancient wisdom and to realize that, quote, the ancient and unglamorous East has invaluable inventories, inventories that are the foundation for the welfare of the world, end quote. Europe was not heaven on earth, Kasravi maintained, but, quote, a land where life is based upon sustained efforts for the accumulation of money without regard for others. In such a land, civilization is many miles away, end quote. How can one be proud of advancement of sciences that had produced bombs, tanks, and homicidal gases? Kasravi then counters argument as to the superiority of the West on account of its scientific progress. As you can see here, he concedes that the West has made progress in some sciences, like history, astronomy, medicine, and so on. So he concedes that, but referring to the rampant use of science and technology for military purposes or for profit mongering, he explains that most of it has not been put to good use. For Kasravi, quote, the sciences were beneficial and appeared as harmless as long as they had not fallen into the hands of Europeans. But contemporary science is more harmful than beneficial, end quote. European doctors and professors have made science an instrument of thievery and deceit, rather than a means of promoting human happiness and justice. In a related passage, Kasravi then launches into a fierce attack on European philosophy. Referring specifically to the theory of evolution, Kasravi contends that Darwinism has been and continues to be one of the most dangerous and harmful doctrines of Europe. It has created a world where there's somewhere also, I can't help but to say that, there's also somewhere that he makes fun of Hegel, specifically Hegel's idea of antithesis. But anyway, there was, I would have been going on for 2 hours. Darwinism has created a world where the powerful trample upon the weak, where every person fends for themselves in a soulless environment characterized by cutthroat competition, and where vices such as crushing your fellow human beings for your own profit and amassing wealth and power have found justification in such harmful philosophies. Next. This passage is a bit long, but I think it's worth going over together. Okay. So, as is very evident, in the first part of this paragraph, Kasravi is obviously referring to Darwinism. In the second part, he is referring to social Darwinism, people who extend the Darwin's ideas to society. And then in the third part, he is obviously referring to the ideology informing the practice of eugenics. And that's a Kasravi thing. He'll never say Darwin or he'll never say eugenics, but he'll just allude to it. Good luck doing the guesswork. Eugenics, which is selective breeding among humans with desirable traits in order to improve human species. Eugenics, as you know, would later become the ideology that propelled the Nazi state's scientific experiments. And here's another of Ain's predictions that people were saying has actually become realized. Some have gone as far as saying that the modern science of genetics is intricately entangled with eugenics. Kasravi uses these examples to argue that Europe and Europeans are no more than masters of tool making, abzar sazi, or master iron workers, استاد آهنگری, who lack wisdom. Yes, they're good at making tools, but they lack the wisdom, therefore dangerous, and whose philosophical views amount to no more than, quote, the most meaningless prattle, end quote, بیهوده ترین سخن. Having enumerated other flaws in the West, such as the animosity among political factions and the ineffectiveness of the Western legal system, Kasravi ends Ain by trying to dissuade people from following in Europe's, quote, dangerous and injurious path. راه بیمناک و پرآسیب. It was still not too late for the East to return to its own ancient and wise ways, although it was getting late very quickly. Next slide, please. In the first part, he's basically saying, look, Europe is in a terrible situation. And then in the second part, he's warning the people of the West to not follow this path. And what people of the East, and what the people of the East needs, as you can see here there in the fifth or sixth line, says some guides. I just wanted to highlight the part that he says the people of the East need some guides to prevent them from following in Europe's dangerous path. Some have argued that ending Ain on these notes points to the fact that Kasravi was possibly starting to see himself in the role of this guide, especially since he would go on to establish Pakdini and to write its scripture, as it were, Majrab and Bunyad. However, it can be argued relatively confident that at least in Ain, this was not entirely the case. Kasravi makes ample reference to Eastern prophets of yore and how it was them, not him, who had laid out the correct path before humanity. What Kasravi did do in proposing religion as the answer, however, was to reimagine Islam, to quote Professor Tawakkoli, as, quote, a paradigm of ethical life. Kasravi's Islam was a rational and future-looking project rather than a sedimented tradition grounded in fatalism and expectations, end quote. Kasravi himself outlined the contours of this alternative Islam at the end of book 1 of Ain, and that's too long for a slide, so I'm just going to read that quote because I think it beautifully summarizes what we just heard Professor Tawakkoli describe as a paradigm of ethical life, Islam as a futural Islam as a paradigm of ethical life. Quote, let us now advise what religion is. We recoil from any religion that separates humans from each other, advantaging one group over the others. We abhor any religion that is the cause of strife and bloodshed. We are referring to the religion in which humans enjoy fraternity and equality, and in which no one seeks advantage over others. A religion in which the more charitable individuals are, the more valued they will be, and in which outer adornment does not earn one worth or station. We are referring to the religion in which humans resist greed and heed others' benefit and loss in their dealings and trade. We are referring to the religion in which everyone considers it his duty to assist the desolate and to be mindful of his neighbors and his relatives' state. You can see everything he's saying is basically ethical. We are referring to the religion in which the affluent are concerned about the poor, and the poor tolerate difficulties without coveting the wealth of the affluent. We are referring to the religion in which humans consider thievery and fraud a disgrace and not take pride in the riches which they have accumulated through theft and dishonesty. We are referring to the religion in which humans judge themselves superior to animals, consider as their duty more than simply eating sleeping and indulging in self-gratification, and not torment each other like wild beasts, end quote. Kasravi's conception of religion was therefore informed by this ethos of humanity and coexistence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we already have questions. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to jump into question.
Yes.
Well, thank you for that very good discourse. I'm kind of, wrestling with myself with certain things that have been propitiated over here. For example, being a model of ethics. And the first is that this guy, Ayn, is probably kind of more modern. Do you think that he sort of carried over from Nostradamus? Because Nostradamus had predicted about the Second World War very graphically.
Thank you for your question, Sam. I'm not sure to what extent he was familiar with the works of Nostradamus, but I don't think it's his plan to actually talk about or make predictions. He has something else in mind, but it's basically an extension of his logic. He's saying, look, I'm laying it bare before your eyes. I mean, it's obvious. This is what the industries are based on. They're based on making more lethal weapons, which then they can. Then he for example, he cites the Sino-Japanese War, and he says, look at this ridiculous show. Back and forth, League of Nations, conventions against the use of gases and so on, and yet nobody held Japan really accountable to what they were doing. So it's obvious to me that there will be another war. I think he's making a prediction in that sense as a logical extension of his argument rather than actually setting out.
Prophesize.
Yes, prophesize. Thank you.
And I had a question about Casadias, whereas I kind of applaud him for sort of putting it as a model of ethics, so to speak. But the point is, I am kind of confused by the fact that how it can be so because of what I would consider probably one of the oldest genocides in Iran, of which probably I would say about at least 30 million Zoroastrians were kind of, killed or spiritually kind of, contained. And then that legacy carried on to India as well, where probably 80 million were slaughtered. So I was wondering, in that particular perspective, how does it entirely become a model of ethics?
Sorry, Sam, are you referring to the massacre of Zoroastrians when Islam?
Yes, sir.
I'm not sure about those numbers. I think we have to run that against the population of the world at the time. But he doesn't specifically address that. What Kasravi does mostly is he talks about, as it were, the golden age of Islam, and not just in Iran, in the entire East, where he says this religion. It's interesting, actually. He doesn't use the word Islam a lot at all. I probably not even once. But he's just like he does with Darwin. He's just probably talking about Islam, but he's talking about that ethos of centuries of hospitality, aiding the poor. He makes really interesting observations about how the economic system was working much better than capitalism because people were still doing trade. He makes similar arguments about the legal system, but there was this concern. Trade wasn't done just for its own purpose. It was being done in the context of being mindful of communal well-being.
So in a sense, the question is that was he an Islamic ideologue here?
He doesn't come across as an
Islamic
ideologue.
Doesn't, as you know, he doesn't mention Islam.
Yeah, he does not mention Islam. He means Islam, but he does not.
He says deen.
Yes, he says deen, religion. Yes.
Could be Zoroastrianism,
That's right.
Christianity,
And
Judaism, Islam.
And the long quote that I read at the end, as Professor Tavakkoli said, could describe Buddhism or Christianity.
Thank you. Sarajan, you can unmute yourself. And then after Sarah, we're going to come back to the room for questions and then alternate back to the Zoom.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for your talk today. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on the concept of wisdom and wise by Kasravi. I remember in two quotations you mentioned about the West lacks wisdom, or the East has to go back, or to trust is the Eastern type of wisdom. I was wondering how he's defining that concept.
Thank you, sir, for that very good question. He actually goes into in detail describing how irrational capitalism is, especially when he's talking about the Great Depression and the economic woes. He makes reference to, we've all heard about this, how tons of wheat would be dumped into the sea, or he makes reference also to one of the acts that was passed after the Great Depression or during the Great Depression by the American administration that actually gave money to the farmers to kill their livestock. And he's asking, yes, I get it. This is to, I guess people do this in order to, what's the word? To reignite the economy or create demand or something like that. But he's saying, where is the wisdom of that? There's people dying on the street, and a government law asks farmers to kill their livestock in order to fix the economy. So what are we talking about? Who do we care about here? The economy or people dying on the street? I think that's when he talks about, but it wasn't like that in the East, right? So says, yes, as I was just saying to Sam, yes, there was lots of trade, and yes, there were poor and rich people in the Eastern cultures, but they never adopted such an irrational, economic model where you would dump wheat into the sea in order to keep the economy going, whereas there are thousands of people going hungry. Is that right?
And the Persian term that he uses is kherad?
Kherad, yes.
Kherad. Okay. I was about to ask about the Persian word. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Hamjan, you have a question. I put it up in the chat. Puya is asking it. Doesn't like social Darwinism, but doesn't necessarily reject the validity of biological evolution. How should we think about ideas that knowingly reject or devalue something true in favor of something that could be called by some sentimental nativism? Or is the trap of binarism?
We value something true in favor of something that could be called by some sentimental. You know what, Puya, thank you for your question. Kasravi makes it clear. He says, listen, I'm not talking about the accuracy of this or not. He says the same thing about Hegel, which says the Europeans love to use Hegel's notion of antithesis. So whatever came in the past was bad. And so that's why we need to make something new. And it says they do this blindly. And I think there's also a part in the quote that was displayed that says, we're not concerned about how accurate evolution theory is. It might be, but really, what are you doing with it is the question.
Social Darwinism.
That's right, social Darwinism. Eugenics. And he says, really? I mean, that clearly comes from, we want to create a race of humans that is strong enough, survival of the fittest, right? The Nazis and so on. In numerous places, actually, in Ayn, he says, don't they know that even if a philosophy is, he says, well, first of all, nobody can say can confirm or approve the accuracy of these theories. But even if they were accurate, it still doesn't change our argument. Our argument is, where's the wisdom to put these into good use, to step back and see, okay, yes, sure, creating demand, saving the economy, but hello, there is wheat being thrown into the ocean that could feed the people. So his argument is kind of like tries to actually mindfully avoid those complications of theory and philosophy and get into the bare bone issues of human life. So
eating
and
we have
economic reasons.
That's right.
Now we have questions here, and then we go back to the Zoom. David goes first. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for your talk, and
go loud, David. Go louder.
Thank you so much for your talk, and just mad respect for your translation. I can imagine that is an incredible amount of work. And it's so refreshing also to have just your summary of someone who is critiquing Europe and America included, etc. And I was wondering if you could talk about whether or not the author struggled with or talks about how to struggle with or deal with what gets inherited. You did mention that he also is critiquing those in Iran who are sort of become the yes men for Europe or incorporate ideas of Europe as if that is wisdom. As a scholar I really like talks about unmastery, this idea that Fanon, even Gandhi and other scholars had to wrestle with this sense of mastery. Even though they were rejecting the powers that colonized them, there was still this weight of like, well, how do we do it differently than what was imposed on us? And I was just curious if there was like any discourse about navigating that sense of how do you take what you, or like go back to the past, like you were saying. I'd love to hear more about the specific actual ancient wisdom.
Yes.
Anyway, too much, but just so curious to hear about how that, if that's of interest for you to talk about.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for that question. Actually, it came up as I was talking to Dr. Shahshai in the halls before the talk. What's the solution, basically, if I understand your question? Can we?
Yeah.
Right. There was. Can we really go back in the 21st century to pastoral life and ditch the cars and so on? Is this what he's? And I think that's where, as you rightly said, that's where a lot of post-colonial figures like Gandhi or Fanon and the rest of them, they're all very good at pointing out the problem. But do we have a program that can replace it? Of course, that's a larger philosophical questions of how do we get rid of modernity once we get afflicted by it. But okay, so for example, he says, here's an example. He gives ample examples, which I obviously couldn't mention in a short talk. But he says, look, for centuries, for example, in every town and city, and he cites historians, Muslim historians, says for centuries, every time from Merv in today's Afghanistan to the Horn of Africa to Iran and the rest of it, almost in every town there was an inn that was open to all for free. So he says we have that experience. Why can't we do it again? Or he gives other examples of. Until recently, he says, even today in the smaller towns in Iran, people leave their houses, doors are open. Nobody locks anything and nobody takes anything. Even though there are affluent and poor people, the rich people care a lot about, building schools or throwing public free feasts and so on every time. Few months or something. So he says we can draw on these lived experiences in the East and create a society that's technological, futural, but at the same time can readopt, yes, and caring, readopt some of those examples of Eastern wisdom that he's talking about.
I know we don't have time, but I'd also love to hear more another time about whether or not that's how we would read it as ecological or environmental. Some of the phrasing of the translation was super interesting to me. Both the animals as like a symbol or allegory against, but also then he's clearly aware of the environmental destruction.
Absolutely, he
of
is.
all of these ridiculous ways of
And that's Castor. He'll never say environment. He'll never say Darwinism, but he's very well aware of it. Absolutely.
Amazing. What a refreshing, exciting author.
One more question from here, and then we're back to the Zoom. Leila, go first. I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Hamid, for the great talk, and I look forward to reading the translation. I actually haven't read Ayn, so the question reflects that. So it seems like a lot of the critiques of Western sciences is really targeted at Western militarism, Western technological developments that lead to militarism. I'm wondering, and that's certainly one of the ways Western sciences comes to the East. So the study of Western science is in part motivated by the development of militaries in this region. But then the other end of it is medicine. So I'm wondering, how does he engage with Western medicine? And yeah.
So he clearly says, there is a point, so funny, there is a point he lambasts the West so much that he even himself feels bad. And somewhere in the book and says, we're not trying to trash the West, and they've done some good stuff, including medicine. And he says that's really something that we can look up to at the West. And he makes a general argument about science. His lesson, he uses the metaphor tent. He says, throughout the ages, science has erected its tent in different lands. For sometimes sciences were in Egypt, and then they were in the lands of Islam, and today they are in Europe. So they don't have a claim on it. However, it's how you put it to use. And he says, yes, they've done some good stuff like medicine, other technologies, but he says most of their stuff has created more depression, environmental degradation, wars, and conflict. And so I don't get it why they think they're so superior.
So there's no critique of.
No, there's no critique. Yeah, he says, that's very good. I mean, the medical sciences,
very positive.
Very positive
Except
about the medical
eugenics.
science. Yes, except genetics and eugenics. And
well, that's what I was going to ask about.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, sciences are tied to, like, the development of Western medicine is tied to eugenics and is tied to other forms of, like, how this stuff gets tested, but none of that is.
He doesn't get into so much detail about it. He says it's just commendable that they've made some good progress in, but even there, he says that's why there were like so many footnotes in this book. You need to make it more accessible. There's also places where, without saying it, he's actually making a reference to the pharmaceutical industrial complex. And he says, even that is now being used. Doctors refer you to so-and-so, so you can get that.
Thank you.
So we go follow-up question to Leila. Okay, go ahead. Then we go back home to Zoom. Sorry, to our Zoom audience.
Some of the good sciences he listed, I was surprised to see it because it included like astronomy and medicine and history, if I'm not mistaken. So
Yes.
I was wondering like what he meant by like history here, like the Western historiography, because he was very critical of the
He meant
Hegelian idea of like evolution, essentially.
he meant the scientific study of history. And he says, as opposed to things like, for example, Banagers, or narrative history. So he says that's good, that's commendable. He loved astronomy because as a young man he had read that, he'd seen the Halley, and he'd read a book that was translated from French that had explained the science of asteroids in plain language, and he loved it. And that's probably why he abandoned his turban and his clerical role, and says, so there is some good stuff in Western science, but he doesn't call it Western science. It's a science the way it's being utilized currently in the West.
So we go back now to our Zoom audience. Please unmute yourself. Katsuya, you can unmute yourself whenever you want.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. My question go back to his conception of religion or din that he conclude his book. Where did he get, or what's the root of his sort of anthropocentric or human-oriented conception of religion with the displacement of God as being the center? So, and he, I think, is mostly talking about monotheistic religion. And I'm wondering if he had any kind of knowledge of other non-monotheistic tradition like Confucianism, where there's a tradition and ethics without like Almighty God. And when you hear his conclusion, it sounds more like more social human-oriented system like Confucianism than Islam or Christianity. But, you know, I find that puzzling where suddenly he's sort of like this very social, human-oriented conception of religion, and he doesn't talk about God. So I find that very interesting. I'd like you to illuminate where he got that conception.
Thank you, Katsu. That's an excellent question. And you're absolutely right, as was evident in that quote that was read at the end. Keep in mind, he keeps saying in the book, he keeps saying Eastern wisdom, Eastern wisdom. So it's true that he gives examples of Muslim lands, as some of the examples were shared earlier, but he means in general. He means in East, and you're absolutely right. So that extends to, without naming it, Buddhism. And so I wouldn't be, his Pakdini also was very similar. It's almost like an eclectic pot, if you will, based on Islamic belief, but very eclectic, basically delicious stew of all Eastern religions. You're absolutely right. So he does not. He's very much concerned with the practical consequences, and that's what I think. That's what makes him Katsuo. I think that's what makes him modern, right? Rather than being theologically stuck on the notion of God and understanding God, he's very concerned on day-to-day consequences of a religion that you practice.
And humans.
And human, yeah,
not
absolutely.
religion.
Yes.
Is more of a humanist.
Oh, he uses that term as well, humanism, or danigeri, for example, he says several times in the book. So his religion is very humanistic, and he's very concerned with, how do policies and the ways we think affect people on the street? Do they have stuff to eat? So he really distances himself from those theological questions as well.
But humanism is not really something that is very much, it's not a term that is in the Iranian tradition, is it?
Bani Adam.
Yeah, thank you. Sadi, Bani Adam اعضای یکدیگرند. I think so, very much so it is, yes.
Dr. Jaskowski, if you want to unmute yourself, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you. I'll first take down my hand. Okay, can you hear me? Because I'm sorry, I'm in a cafe because otherwise you'd be hearing mostly my son, not me. So it's more a answer to one of the previous questions, because there was one question about the attitude Kasravi had for the early, let's say, rise of Islam in Persia. So if I remember correctly, it would be mostly about his early, let's say, views of the subject. He doesn't dwell as much as on the topic in Oim, but if I remember correctly, he discusses it a bit in his Shahriyaran Gumnam, which is a bit early, if I remember correctly. And there you have this kind of dual idea he has, because on one hand, he clearly, let's say, considers Islam at that point of time, let's say, to be a good thing. But on the other hand, he is clearly fascinated by the, let's say, what he sees a resistance, for example, of the Daylamite, etc. And I think his view can be some at the, let's say, early Kasravi's view of Islam in Persia could be summarized with title of one of his articles, I think from Peyman. I don't remember the exact title, but something like "Our ancestors didn't know Islam, so they resisted. Then they learned more about it and they accepted it." Obviously, it's not as simple as that with later Kasravi. So that's, I think, one point, and another would be regarding the word he uses for wisdom. He used the term kharat. He also clearly uses it as a separate term than the one he uses for intelligence, because in his work, I think that piramune kharat, but I guess you'll find it all around his later works because they're very repetitive, to be honest. His later works, I mean. He mentions that one of the few Westerners or philosophers who entertained, let's say, the thought of what's wisdom is Darwin, but he clearly confused it with, and he says he confused Kherat with Andishe, which Andishe is what he uses to mean intelligence, probably, or thinking in general. So these are my very brief comments. Sorry for interrupting and taking time from other guests. So I'll be turning off my microphone again. Thank you very much for the meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Jaskowski. It's
And nice
to
to see all of you more or less in person.
This is the first time we actually see each other, even though we wrote we've back and forth a lot through email. I think you beautifully responded to two of the questions I think Katsuo and Sam were asking. So thank you for that, Dr. Jaskowski.
Dr. Dotger, we still can't hear you.
I
think he can hear us, but he
asked the type his question.
He can't hear us. We can.
Yeah, Dr. Dotger, if you can hear us, you can type your question in the chat and I can read it to Dr. Yazdi here. There's no hand up. Okay. So I'm going to come back to the room, and as soon as you have your question, we're going to answer it.
I just wanted to know. I mean, it was amazing. I didn't know much about Ayn. I knew a lot about Sufi-Gari, obviously, and other Shia-Gari and stuff. And those books were kind of, to me, and all of them, you can correct me and we can debate this perhaps after, is the crisis of identity, kind of.
Yes.
Even if it is scientific work that Arifan Ashruta, but how much of the Ayn is a reaction to what is happening on the ground historically in Iran? And obviously around the world, you explain a lot of it, but how much of it is Iranian reaction of identity to what is going on with all colonialism and everything that you mentioned?
If I understand, thank you, August. If I understand the question correctly, and I think this, Dr. Jaskowski just talked about this, there is this mixed feeling. You're right. This mixed feeling. So there is this admiration for what Europe has done. They've made advances. You can't just, reject that wholesale. So there's this admiration, but there's also this feeling of humiliated by the West, that they've come here and done whatever they wanted. There's also that irrationality of Western practices, and there's some admiration for some of the aspects of Islam. But then when you come to the context of Iran, as we all know, there's always that mixed feeling about Islam. Yes, it's been great, but, they killed our ancestors and so on. And I think as Dr. Jaskowski was just saying, that has also reflected in Kasravi as well. So on the one hand, he says, yeah, these are the bad things that the Muslims did, but we didn't really know true Islam. It's a good thing now, and we need to go back to it. The same idea with Europeism. Yes, we need to learn from them how to do science and how to become militarily advanced, but we need to do it in a wise way, wisely. I don't know if that answers. Yeah.
Dascosi had the hand up. I think he was going to answer that question. So please unmute yourself.
You could ask us Dascosi to answer the rest of the question. Moving forward.
Thank you. Sorry for disturbing you all again. As if I understood it correctly, whether he was reacting with owing to what's happening not only in the world but in Iran, we have his own account of what led him to write it. Although we have to keep in mind it was an account he wrote much later in life when he was already this, let's say, religious or semi-religious leader. So we have to take it maybe with a grain of salt. But he basically thought that there are serious problems in the West, and are being adopted, these problems, let's say, in Iran. And the final, let's say, straw that brought camels back would be one of his colleagues who came back from America and wrote a book which thought that is praising American way of life, which Kasravi thought was kind of horrible, because basically was praising the fact that even small children are working all the time and that it's good, yes? So that's, I think that, yeah, he was reacting not only to the developments in the West, but mostly to, let's say, the Iranian adoption of these developments, especially as he, let's say, he wasn't very, let's say, traveled person. So that's the West he knew in person, was the West he knew from, let's say, books and from meeting people inside Iran. Well, unless you count a trip to the Tsarist Russia. So that's, I think, what I can add, if I added anything of value.
So as you said, the book that his friend wrote, praising life in America, Kasravi read it and thought, that's not praise. This is, to me, that's exactly what's wrong with America. And how can you write this book and say, I remember you mentioned in your article, one of the examples was the guy said his friend who had written the book said, America is so great, time is so valuable there. Everybody values time. And says, wait a second, people have been so compartmentalized, and they don't have any time for themselves. There are the tools of capitalism. That's why time, if they put a money price, on time. So he says, what you've written here is not really a praise. I can read it exactly in my way, which is a critique.
Especially when you think about it, the thing I don't remember whether it's in Varjavan Bunyod or in one of his, let's say, economic writings, his ideal system would be the one where everyone works only 2 hours a day, which for me sounds perfect, but it's complete opposite of what was and is happening in the world.
Another interesting thing, in his ideal system, kids would go to school for only up to age 7 or something, from 7 to 10. And it says the rest of it is just a waste of time. All this time in high school and, junior high and all that stuff, they should actually be sent to trades where they can learn useful stuff. So he even critiques Western educational system.
So we have one more question, or more than one more question inside the room. We're going to go back to that and then go back to Zoom. Please go ahead. Louder. Much louder.
Thank you for my question is that why is kind of substitution of this? Because crisis is one system to have a reformation of production. Comparing that with anti-Christian, we see that, okay, at the end, I thought with just eradicating them, just getting away from it. Why in Iran, I don't know, Islamic criticism, we just want to do still something in Islam itself? Why there is nothing else that is
Did I understand the question correctly? You said why he didn't attack Islam directly? Is that... Oh, sorry.
Because on the basis of these tags, I expected him to say, okay, Islam is something that we should replace it with law. But at the end, he said, okay, it's better to have information than just eradication. But when it comes to the questions, and when we have something like that, just like in the case of Israel, we see that at the end, says, well, okay, all the criticism to religion, we should just get away from that.
Get away from religion.
Why is the religion a solution then, even if reform?
Oh,
I
right.
mean, we can argue that why Shia, he criticizes Shia Gari, but not Islam.
Yeah.
Because, you know, they go.
Or why is he...
Why not?
So so basically your question is, why isn't he living up to the expectation of him being a secular? Naturally, it's not. I think I kind of answered that question at the beginning, saying there is a little bit of both. There is a little bit of both. So you can't really, we can't, and that doesn't, from my understanding of modern Iranian history, this applies to other Iranian thinkers, not just Kasravi, that you just can't pigeonhole them. You just can't. I mean, they set out, even for example, Jalal Ahmad, he writes Gharb Zadegi, but then he's Gharb Zadeh in many ways, right? And so the same goes with Kasravi. I guess on one level he wouldn't dare attack Islam directly. He did Shiism.
Well, he did that. But I would go to what you initially noted, that religion, being, for him did not mean dogma, but ayn zindagi, caring for others. And it wasn't exclusively Islamist or Christian. It was, he viewed all religions being grounded on ayn zindagi, caring for others, caring for human beings, and sort of a humanist understanding of religion that was really, Iran Shah was one of the places where he got some of these really humanist ideas. Yes.
But also, sorry to intervene, it's the side of ethics, right? Like what the last quote shows is he sees it, religion as the side of ethics and law as the alternative that you posed he had a problem with, because that requires enforcement. It's an externally enforced, whereas piety is an internal side of ethics. Is how
exactly
self-policing.
Not self-policing, but thank you.
We're going to go back to Yasser and then back to our online. Yes, sir, please.
Dr. Rezaei, many thanks for your wonderful talk. I was wondering, to what extent do you think Ahmad Kasravi influenced other intellectual and even famous cleric such as Ayatollah Khomeini? Because I think we can, at least we can see the trace of Ahmad Kasravi's idea in Kashmir.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Farshad. Absolutely, you're absolutely right, to a large extent. And I think Professor Tavakkoli has written about that. And even Ayatollah Khomeini, I mean, he attacks Kasravi, almost calls for his death in Kashmir, and yet he bases Velayat al-Faqih very much on, I think Kasravi's Pak Dini would look like Velayat al-Faqih, only someone would be wearing a tie, not a turban. So Khomeini and many other intellectuals as well drew on Kasravi's work, absolutely, to a large extent, very influential.
Some of the key figures of Islamism in Iran were initially followers of Kasravi and then turned to Islam when Kasravi is murdered and banished. Yeah.
And some of them consciously, sorry, as Professor Tawakoli has explained, consciously avoided attribution.
That's right.
Because they were scared that, they might also get gunned down or knifed down.
We have one chat question. Hamid Faramaz is asking, to what extent was he influenced by Zoroastrian thoughts when writing on specifically?
How do you guys expect me to know everything? But thank you, Faramaz, for that.
There was a mention of Zoroastrian.
Yeah, I think just a few minutes ago, Dr. Jaskowski explained that very well. In earlier works, like historical works, like Shahriyaran Gomnam, obviously he has this feeling of praise for Persian heritage, Zoroastrianism. I don't know how much of it he had in mind when writing Ahin, but I can tell you this, that he had turned into this cosmopolitan intellectual at that stage of his life, where he was very much open to Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and his religious, ethical religion incorporates all of that. I don't know if hopefully that answers your question.
Dr. Jaskowski has his hand up. I think after that.
He should have been here.
Thank you. Unfortunately, travel costs and time, as we've already discussed, which is extremely valuable. Yes, so one thing would be about Zoroastrian thoughts. There's also always the problem to what extent, for example, he knew these other religions other than Islam. We know he had, for example, some knowledge of Middle Persian because he translated Kornamak Ardashir, if I remember correctly. And also we know it from his polemics with Bahor. Part of the polemics was that he lent to Bahor some of his books, and Bahor, instead of taking notes with pencil, took them in pen, and it was part of a huge, let's say, they exchanged a lot of personal attacks in the journals at the time. But more, what I have to add is with regards to the other question that occurred here, and of course I've already forgotten what I wanted to say. I feel really silly now. The general idea where he got some of his ideas from, because there's this issue whether, especially to what extent he was influenced, for example, by Mirza Kermoni, etc. And well, basically, Kasravi, especially later in his life, would say that he wasn't influenced by anyone. It's all his own ideas, but and that he even barely read any things by Mirza Kermoni. I'm not so sure about it. If I remember correctly, Feridun Odamiyat thought that he basically took these ideas from some of his ideas from Kermoni. There was, if I remember correctly, also a PhD thesis written many years ago in Germany on possible influences of, I think it was Tolebov, but I'm not sure, on Kasravi. But it was basically an account of Kasravi's ideas, then a brief chapter on Tolebov, what Tolebov thinks, what were Tolebov's ideas, and 2 sentences at the end that, as we can see, they clearly impacted Kasravi. It's not a clear, we don't know whether he read these particular works, for example, and also I don't remember whether it was Tolebov or another thinker of the time. But I believe that what impacted him the most from these earlier thinkers was not a particular thinker in general, but let's say the whole milieu of the time. So that's one thing. Another regarding Islam. There was a question of why he did not attack Islam itself. Well, he wrote a book on Islam as well, which is less, let's say, strong, let's put it that way, or less explicit than the one he wrote on Shiism. But he says that, well, it was a good thing, but it's not good anymore, basically. And he points out, for example, now that the Muslims are living in various countries, there's no one single Islamic country. Hajj makes no sense, basically. That's the gist of it. And the whole argument goes like this. And we could also go to his entire view of what religion is, but I don't think we have enough time. The gist of it is that there's basically one true religion for all the time, which gets corrupted. And apart from the true prophets are always false prophets who basically, whose work is mimicking the proper prophet of the time. So for him, for example, there were these guys in times of Muhammad. For Zoroastrianism, if I remember correctly, it was either Mani or Mazdak. I don't remember which one he cites. I think he cites Mani. And and also, for example, for him, an example, the works of Bab or Baha'u'llah were also in this form, that they're basically mimicking the way they think Muhammad worked, etc., etc. So that's the summary. Sorry for taking your time.
Thank you, Dr. Rostovsky, very much. And thank you, Dr. Yazdi, incredibly a lot for this very, very illuminating talk. And I'm really sorry, Dr. Dalgad, that I couldn't hear you. Maybe you can catch up with Hamid later in the department. Thank you all for coming, and you'll see this recording up on the website very soon.
Thank you so much.